Hi, everybody. This is Christopher Phillips, the founder and executive director of Democracy Cafe, a nonprofit dedicated to making ours a more connected and participatory world. Our podcast, Cafe Aretista, is dedicated to having guests who I consider Aretistas. As you know, I'm a Greek U.S. citizen, and arete is about social conscience and excellence, in which cultivation of self and greater autonomy for all individuals and social conscience goes hand in glove. And so, Larry Lessig, you can't beat me off with a stick, and I think that's the only reason you joined our Democracy Cafe Advisory Board. Thank you so much for being on our program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, Larry, unlike your Supreme Court argument, I'm doing this by video. I'm very high tech.
I was actually quite happy that they didn't have video at the Supreme Court because that meant we could be looking at notes or looking wherever we wanted when I was, answering questions.
You could do that with me.
All right, great.
So you know what? So the Wall Street Journal editorial board came out and slammed you like 2 seconds after you'd finished. I mean, they were just waiting to pounce. Chaos, pandemonium, just like, They didn't even wait. They didn't even look at the nuance of it. I don't even know if they even listened to it. But I'm worried that too many people are going to try to oversimplify it.
Well, we took this case originally because we thought the question should be resolved. And in one sense, it felt like a perfectly hedged case because we either won or we lost. And if we lost, it was going to be incredibly interesting to see how the Supreme Court wrote that opinion. Because for the originalists, for the conservatives who say that they care about interpreting what the original meaning of the Constitution is, this is a slam dunk simple case. There's just literally no doubt that by creating, quote, electors given the power to vote by ballot, the framers of the Constitution meant to create people who had a certain discretion. Now, the other side keeps on talking about something called unfettered discretion, which is a little bizarre because no discretion is unfettered. I mean, when you think about a Republican senator from Missouri, like Josh Hawley, who's elected to the Republican Senate, I mean, he's got discretion, but it's not unfettered. He's got obligations to country and to party. So, he's going to vote for a Republican to be the majority leader in the Senate. And he's likely to vote for 99% of what the Republicans put up, but nobody would doubt he's free to vote with the Democrats, as John McCain did on the repeal of Obamacare. So it's a weird sense of discretion that they're talking about, but there's no doubt that the framers conceived of electors in the same way that we now conceive of congresspeople or senators as people with an inherent discretion. And so from the standpoint of what the Constitution originally meant, this is a simple case. Now, the hard question is, well, so what do we do with that fact? And ordinarily, those originalists say, well, chaos be damned. The question is what the Constitution means. See, for example, the Second Amendment. People say, my God, this is terrible. That you imagine people having a right to bear arms in the middle of cities with handguns or these machine guns. It's a terrible thing. And the court's response is, well, I'm sorry, that's what the framers gave us. And if you don't like it, then amend it. But here, where there's this totally hypothetical fear, they just couldn't stop themselves from racing off into crazy land. So I'm not, I'm actually not sure I have a clear sense of what the court's going to do yet. I think a lot of people are misreading some of the questions and the character, but we'll see.
You were kind of hard on yourself, I felt, when you wrote your thoughts about it in Medium.
Well, I'm always hard on myself. As I said in it, I literally never speak without waking up the next day tormented by what happened, by what I said, what I thought I should have said, how I could have said it differently. So, that's par for my course. But I do think that it's a hard context to engage. And what was frustrating about it is that so much of the stuff we had to engage was in the atmosphere. It wasn't actually in the briefs. And so, when the Campaign Legal Center and Issue 1 came in and started talking about chaos, these completely uncross-examined claims, it's hard to know how in 100 words you're supposed to dislodge that quote terror.
Right.
But that's the challenge.
But you even, I mean, some of it could have been dispensed with before that stage of the argument, where even the notion of bribery was something that would only be discovered after the fact, and then they could easily, eliminate that person if it was discovered.
Yeah, I mean, so the problem is, as with many issues, it's actually pretty complicated how you think through it. And the challenge is, how do you simplify a complicated idea
Right.
and present it in 20 seconds? So, the complicated idea is, with bribery, for example,
Mhm.
there's first the question whether it can be regulated. And the Campaign Legal Center's brief suggests it's not regulated, which we thought was complete bullshit. It is regulated right now under 18 U.S.C. 201. So it's a crime to engage in bribery for an elector to be bribed, which is why of the 23,507 electors in our history, not a single one has been bribed. I mean, there are half as many Congress people, and there are a couple dozen of them have been bribed, but not a single elector. Okay, but the first question is, can you regulate it? Yes. But then the second question is, well, how would you actually, bring about the restraint of that regulation?
Mm-hmm.
And here's where it was just so hard to get people to be realistic about this. I mean, you can't have a regime where all it takes is for somebody to say, hey, that elector's bribed, for that elector to be kicked off. I mean, that's crazy. There's such a thing as due process. And so what that means is it's really practically impossible to imagine prosecuting a bribery before the Electoral College votes. Okay, so the Electoral College votes. And it's at that stage that you're likely to see bribery, or at least see indications that there's bribery or not. If you've got a normal election where there's a winner of the popular vote and he's going to win the Electoral College, and for reasons completely inexplicable, 36 electors from one side flip and go to the other side, there's pretty good reason to wonder what the hell's going on here. And that would be the regulation of bribery. And at that stage, you could be prosecuting for it. The challenge is that if you ask the question, what Congress is actually allowed to do under the Constitution, it's not an easy question. So the purists would say, Congress can't do anything. So there's a great paper by Vassan Kasavan about the Electoral Count Act. And his argument's pretty strong. He says, the framers said Congress has the power to, quote, count votes. And what that means is they can never look at the quality of the vote or the integrity of the vote. They just have to count them. And from that perspective, you're kind of left in this place that if somebody gets away with bribery in casting the vote, they might go to jail for the rest of their life, but that vote counts. But that position nobody ever wants to accept. So that's why, Josh was, when Justice Breyer eventually framed it in such a powerful way, you're not going to see it until the actual vote. And so when the vote happens and Congress decide whether to count it or not, the Electoral Count Act says you count it if it's a regularly given vote, and maybe you'd say that bribery is not a regularly given vote. That's a plausible argument. It's not much of a fudge on anything, and that's probably what would happen. But again, what's so striking is it's a completely fabricated fear. I mean, never happened. No. It would obviously be easy to see it if it did happen. Right. It would completely undermine the credibility of a president who was elected because it happened. Right. So, where's the incentive for it to happen? As opposed to, what happened in Florida in 2000, whereas you can just get Secretary of State to screw up the counting of a vote on one side, you can flip, 25 electoral votes on one shot, and nobody ever has to go to jail for that. So, it just was so frustratingly unrealistic. And yet, that's what you have to battle with.
Well, I listened to it. I thought you distilled and simplified perfectly. My concern is that then people start oversimplifying and caricaturing. The Frodo Baggins stuff, suddenly the memes and everything else, and to the point that we lose sight of exactly what you're trying to do and you're on the board of equalcitizens.us, and the idea is to generally provide one person one vote.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually, have never been a supporter of the idea of arguments being broadcast, either televised or, what happened here. And I think one of the reasons for it is that there's this, unresistible temptation to play to the relevant audience. So here's Justice Thomas, who, God bless him, who for the whole of his time on the court can barely ever ask a question, and now he's become the most prolific questioner on the bench. I think I hold the honor of having answered more Justice Thomas questions than anybody in the history of his tenure on the Supreme Court. And then he pulls out a Frodo Baggins, and he's like, if it were just in the Supreme Court with a bunch of lawyers and the other justices, I'm sure Frodo Baggins would never have made an appearance. So there's the one weirdness about that. But the other thing is, it's not easy to describe or to understand a strategy, but there's a strategy. And so the strategy in step one is with the Electoral College is to make clear what the Electoral College is. Mm-hmm. And one thing that's frustrating the way that this thing played out is that we believe the Electoral College is an institution that reserves this freedom to its electors. Right. And if all of the outrage and fear-mongering, hair on fire reactions followed the Supreme Court affirming that obvious view, then we could have leveraged it to do something good, to say, okay, you don't like this college the framers gave us? Let's do something about it. Let's talk about how we can amend the Constitution to get a better college. What should that look like? And we're actually developing a project to propose an amendment which we believe genuinely benefits both parties in more than 3/4 of the states of America. So it fits to a T the kind of amendment that should be able to be passed. Mm. But if we lose in this case, it'll just be harder because the Supreme Court will have done the work to fix one part of the electoral college, and instead of allowing democracy to do it for us.
So even if this one doesn't receive a majority of votes, it's by no means Sisyphean because you have multiple strategies to.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've spent every moment of my life the last 3 years focused on the question of the Electoral College, but we've got 3 different strategies that are going on. One is challenging the status of electors to establish what electors are. The second is challenging winner take all in the Electoral College, because when you stand back and you think, what is the biggest problem with the Electoral College? It's not so-called faithless electors. Indeed, they have never been a problem. They've never, ever once voted. Well, I'm sorry, once. The very first time we had one, did we have an elector vote in a context where his vote could have mattered. Every other one, there was no doubt that the so-called faithless electors' vote would just not matter. So that's not the problem with the Electoral College. The problem with the Electoral College is that the winner of the popular vote in a state gets all of the electors in that state. And the reason that's a problem is that it means the only states that a presidential candidate cares about are the so-called swing states.
Yeah.
So in 2016, there were 12 of them or 14 of them. This year, there are probably 9, maybe 8. And so what that means is both campaigns bend over backwards to make those 8 states happy, leaving the other 43, because you include the District of Columbia in that list, irrelevant. And empirical work has demonstrated that the people from these non-swing states do worse from the president than the people from the swing states. So there are certain policies that America has that have always puzzled people. Like, why do we tax steel imports? Like, what is that about? And the reason for that is Pennsylvania is a swing state. Or ethanol? Why are we subsidizing ethanol production? Well, because Iowa is a swing state. So we have all these stupid policies that we have only because these states have such enormous power in our political system. And we have to fix that because we need a president who cares about every state, every American, every single corner of the United States should matter to the president. And there's a simple amendment that no non-swing state person, whether a Democrat or a Republican, should oppose. And that amendment would say electoral votes, instead of having electors, every state will have electoral votes. So you get the same number of electoral votes as you get electors. Mm-hmm. So the state of Montana gets 3 electoral votes. Mm-hmm. But then those 3 electoral votes get allocated proportionally at a fractional level. So you could get 1.426 electoral votes out of Montana. Um, and what that means is if every state allocated their votes in a fractional manner, every state would matter. Every vote in every state would matter. Like if you're running for president, you don't care if you get votes in South Dakota or in Chicago. There's still votes that are going to matter to you. So you're as interested in pitching yourself to South Dakota as you are to Chicago. But this still is not one person, one vote. It's not perfect equal citizens. That would only be achieved by national popular vote, which we don't think is politically possible right now. But the reality is that even though this puts a thumb on the scale to benefit small states, if you look at the bottom 10 states, half of them are red and half of them are blue. So it doesn't matter politically. It doesn't benefit one side, Republicans or Democrats. It's benefiting smaller states rather than bigger, which is a consequence of federalism. So we think this amendment really should have no strong reason for anybody to oppose it. And when you begin to get people to focus on what's wrong with the Electoral College, everybody should support it. And if they support it, then in the context in which we've raised awareness about the Electoral College, we can begin to imagine a movement that could actually achieve some support to make this possible. So that's a big strategy. It's got a lot of moving parts. And I think what's frustrating is when you see so-called reformers who can't be bothered to understand how things fit together or what the strategy is, and light their hair on fire and become outraged at the idea of somebody doing something that might actually have an effect.
It's interesting because I think most people would agree that the system is miserably broken, but the only thing that they may agree on more is that they don't trust each other. That things have become so polarized that they're saying, well, let's just keep it broken because I don't trust you or you to fix it.
But that's what I think that's the most important insight about reform these days. There's the standard way people talk about reform is highly partisan or has a very clear political valence. It's either a reform on the left or reform on the right. And what we should know right now about American politics is such reform cannot happen, just cannot happen, that we can stalemate each other to death. And the only are reform movements that genuinely are able to say, look, we're not Republican or Democrat. We're not trying to help one side or the other. We're just trying to make the system work better. And the two clearest examples of that, in my last chapter of my latest book, They Don't Represent Us. Yeah. I talk about these movements. And these are, movements around gerrymandering and movements around ranked choice voting. And both of these movements, is a very, the one in Michigan has now been memorialized in this really great documentary, Slay the Dragon. But it was, a movement triggered by a 20-something-year-old, Katie Fahey, who right after the 2016 election basically put a Facebook post up and says, anybody want to work with me on gerrymandering?
Incredible.
And by the end, they'd built this huge 4,000-person army in Michigan to rally the state to the idea of gerrymandering reform. But early on that process, Katie embraced an ideal. And the ideal was nobody can talk politics from a partisan perspective in this campaign. You have to check your Republican views, your Democratic views at the door. This is about making democracy work better for everybody. It's not about helping one side or the other. Right. And what she learned, and I think the ranked choice voting movement has learned as well, is that when you can honestly say to people, look, we're not asking you to beat up your neighbor. We're not asking you to make it harder for somebody whose views you disagree with. Mm-hmm. We're asking you to make it easier for democracy to work. That inspires a kind of energy that is almost impossible to imagine in ordinary politics these days. This is a politics of love as opposed to the politics of hate. And I think that we need to find movements that can leverage the politics of love. And because love of country and love of democracy and love of your the idea of citizens, I think has so much more energy behind it than hatred of Republicans or hatred of Donald Trump or hatred of Democrats.
It's so beautifully put. I have to tell you, I got to be honest, if I were voted to serve in the Electoral College for the Democrats, I would write in Katie.
She's not old enough,
What do you mean? How old is she now?
She can't be 35. She just turned 30.
All right. Or Faith Spotted Eagle.
Yeah, well, that somebody did that.
I know. I mean, these people are, to me, they're like Spirit of 76 rabble rousers. I
Yeah,
mean,
you see, but this is the point. I mean, there's been, a large number of these examples.
right.
Like the
Yes.
elector in 1976 who caused the statute in Washington to be passed, a guy named Mag Patton. He was an elector for Gerald Ford. He voted for Ronald Reagan.
Mhm.
Now, when he did that, he didn't think it was going to make it so Ronald Reagan that Gerald Ford lost. He didn't think that it was going to change the result, and it didn't. Everybody knew it wasn't. It was just an act of political expression.
Right.
And in 2016, two of the electors who were attacked, one in Maine and one in Minnesota, voted for Bernie Sanders instead of Hillary Clinton. They were just making a political statement. They weren't trying to change any outcome. And that's the vast majority of non-death cases. And they have, they're meaningless. So what? It's like, what are you going to pass this law and bend the Constitution so you can stop people from supporting the movement, the future of their party? So I mean, it's frustrating to see how easy it is to turn people into crazy people.
Well, I worry that your book, They Don't Represent Us, Reclaiming Our Democracy, didn't hit its stride at the right time. You got to hit just the right crest because it's such an important book. And I think that Americans who actually take the time to read it will understand that you're trying to create really a democratic republic in which everyone's best interest everyone has a chance to get in the fray and see to it that their best interests are represented. You had this great quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and again, I love how you distinguish types of democracy. There can be no real political democracy unless there is something approaching an economic democracy. And as somebody who got his $3,400 check from the government while there was corporate welfare up the wazoo, give me a break! I mean, if ever a book came out that everybody needs to read, it's that book. And yet I worry and wonder whether we're just so caught up in, I don't know. I mean that $3,400 check lasted me about 13 minutes. And yet I feel like there's a sense of impotence but that your book actually made me feel even more empowered than your first book, Republic Lost, in some ways. But
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I don't blame the moment. It's the moment, and if a lot of friends have written books that sit on my shelf, and I'm going to read them. But there are a lot of things going on right now, and I don't blame anybody who's got to worry about how they're going to take care of the kids who don't actually go to school now because schools can't manage. There's a million excuses. But I write books to figure out something. When I start a book, I don't know what I'm going to say. I mean, I have a sense of the direction, the path I want to go on, but I haven't worked it out. And this book in particular, I started this book focused on how the government is unrepresentative of us. But the part I discovered, the part that I am so obsessed with right now, is the way in which we are not representative of us. The second part, the other, they don't represent us. And the most dramatic way in which that manifests itself right now is to see the imperviousness of the president's support to the facts related to this COVID crisis. I mean, I was at the end of the year after the book came out, I wrote a bunch of essays, and I was on some cable news shows about how astonishing it was that the facts around the impeachment had no effect on the attitudes of Republicans about the president. And, there's this great graph I have in the book about looking at Richard Nixon's support and how 6 months before Richard Nixon resigned, Richard Nixon's support among Republicans and support among Democrats begins to fall in perfect correlation. Still Republicans like him more than Democrats do, but Republicans and Democrats both begin to figure out who Richard Nixon is. And when they figure that out, at least half Republicans and 90% of Democrats decide he shouldn't be president. And that's a very edifying, important discovery. Because what it shows is, at that time, because of the media of that time, we were all watching the same shows, we were all listening to the same stories, we could all be brought to an understanding, which was actually a democratic understanding that this man should step aside. And when in August of 1974, leaders from the Senate and from the House Republican Party walked across the mall to the White House and went to the president and said, "Mr. President, you've got to resign." That was it. He had to resign. But what I was talking about at the end of last year was how there was no change in attitudes around Donald Trump or Democrats. I mean, Democrats started pretty low anyway, but it was like nothing had happened. You look at the graphs and they're just straight lines through the period of impeachment. But if you had asked me then, okay, but what if there were some national catastrophe? What if we were attacked, some war, and the president wildly failed to respond, kind of, was just sleeping on the job, almost like Neville Chamberlain in World War II like reaction. And everybody understood, and that was the actual facts. If that happened, would you still see no effect on Republican attitudes to Democrats? I would have said no. I would say there's some limit. Like, people actually dying, that's the limit. And so, it's one thing to talk about ideas about impeachment and whether the president lied or tried to, bribe or whatever. That's all pretty abstract. But when you see grandma dying, that's not abstract. And you begin to understand, and that should have an effect. I would never have predicted that when you look at the graphs of support among Donald Trump, among Republicans and Democrats, still there is no difference. It's had no effect. And that fact, just shows that we live in a media environment that makes it impossible for us to have a democracy. Because if we can't even understand the facts in a coherent way, then how are we supposed to decide anything in a way that makes progress on any important issue? So I increasingly worry this is the critical problem we have to find a way to get over.
Well, all the more reason for you to keep fighting the good fight, and so many of us kindred spirits. And Larry, beloved advisory board of Democracy Cafe and on equalcitizens.us, thank you so much for the gift of your time and for sharing.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks, Larry.
Okay, great. Thank you.